Welcome to the May 13th Economic Development Commission meeting. Commissioners, I'm going to chair tonight's meeting due to the absence of our chair and vice chair. The first item on our agenda is the adoption of the agenda. If there are no additions to the agenda, we need a motion to adopt.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Kleppe, second by Commissioner John. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Second item on the agenda is the adoption of the minutes from the March 11th meeting. Are there any corrections to those minutes? Seeing none, we do need a motion.
So moved.
Motion by Commissioner Cherner, second by Commissioner Shaw. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Same sign if opposed. The motion passes. The third item on the agenda is the Open Business Forum. This is a standing item on the agenda for any business that wishes to address the Economic Development Commission on an item that is not on our agenda. Seeing that there is no one in the audience, there is obviously no one to address the Economic Development Commission, and we will close the Open Business Forum. Fourth item on the agenda is the review of our Wellhead Protection Ordinance. Presenting tonight is Brianne Rothstein. Brianne is our consultant with WSB, and we are so happy to have her back. She was actually an intern here a number of years ago. So there is life after being an intern at the city of Burnsville.
I was just telling Jenny that, or she was just telling me that all the interns go on to bigger and better things from Burnsville.
They go and do great things.
Yeah, it's great things. That's not what I meant. Bigger and better. That couldn't possibly be. But well, thank you. My name is Brianne Rothstein. I'm with WSB and Associates, and I've been helping Steve in Public Works to update or to add a drinking water protection overlay district to the city's zoning code, as well as sections on sewer and water in this overall Burnsville City Code. So tonight we'll just kind of go over the purpose and the intent of the overlay district and talk a little bit about water use in the city of Burnsville, just sort of high-level overview of the water use for the city. Talk about drinking water supply sources and answer the question why we need an overlay district. What is an overlay district, and when does this ordinance apply, and how might it affect businesses? And really that's what we're here to discuss with you, specifically what it means for the businesses, both current and future businesses within this overlay. And then how is the program going to work? How will the city monitor and enforce the district? And finally, a schedule for approval. And finally, if you have any questions, we'll get to those at the end. So in terms of the purpose and the intent of the overlay, what an overlay district is it's a zoning district. So you have your residential, commercial, industrial districts, and an overlay puts an extra layer of regulation or protection on that applies only in a specific area. So a couple of examples of other overlay districts are a floodplain overlay district or a shoreline overlay district. You have your underlying district, but that district also applies in that area. And so what the purpose of this particular district is for is to acknowledge that there are certain areas within the city that are very susceptible to drinking water contamination. And this is a result of the research done and data compiled for the Wellhead Protection Plan. You do two parts to that plan. One is a really data-based analysis of the geomorphology of the underlying aquifer, and then part two really examines the policies of how you're going to protect that. And so this overlay district was a recommendation in the part two. And so it looks at the location of wells relative to the aquifer and its sensitivity, and it uses all sorts of detailed science to kind of come up with where the most susceptible of your aquifer is. And then the other intent of the overlay is to provide for land use and regulations which are compatible with this. So really to try to protect the most sensitive areas of the aquifer and using tools that we have within the zoning code and business regulation. So a little bit about city water use. Annually, the city of Burnsville pumps 3.2 billion gallons of water. So Steve in Public Works can tell you all about all the details of that. There are a number of wells, and I do have a map that shows all of them on the next slide here, but 1.1 billion comes from the quarry. So this is surface water, or it's groundwater that has been come up into the surface of the quarry because of that operation that's there. And then the rest is supplied by 17 wells. So that's a lot of wells. And the majority, most all of them, are located in the same area. Annually, Burnsville provides 80% of Savage's water, too, through a water use agreement. So this becomes even more important because now we sell the water to another city and provide that for them as well. So protection of it is even that much more important than it would be if it was just Burnsville. And then just on a peak day, the city is pumping 20 million gallons of water on that peak day. So just giving you a little bit of scale of the amount of water that is annually pumped as well as the kind of peak day water usage. So this is just a map of all of the wells in the city of Burnsville. So you can see they're kind of concentrated on the north end of town with some exceptions. And then it also shows where the quarry is and how, because that's about a third of the water comes from the quarry, that's also an important area. So why do we need a water supply overlay district? A couple of major reasons here is that Burnsville's drinking water aquifers are susceptible to potential pollution. So there's two things at play here. One is the sensitivity of the aquifer, and the other is the existing land uses that you have within the most sensitive areas. So one of the first questions I had when I started getting into this work was, well, is the sensitivity determined by the susceptibility in terms of what land uses are on there? And indeed, they are two separate things. So first you determine the susceptibility in terms of the aquifer and its characteristics, and then you look at the land uses. So it's possible to have a very sensitive aquifer and have no land uses that could potentially contaminate it and still very sensitive. So it's not the land uses that make it sensitive, if you kind of follow what I'm saying. And then the other reason to do it is that it would provide a framework for verifying existing regulations. So one of the things you'll probably notice as we go through here is that a lot of these things are already required, whether it's through PCA regulations or city regulations. But this is just an extra chance to catch some of those. So it can be an enforcement issue to catch some of those things that are already required and do an inspection that might not be done by the MPCA. So this is a very scientific chart that just shows, the point of it is to show that you've got a number of different aquifers that you're dealing with and a number of different wells. So depending on the depth of the well and the geomorphology, your wells are hitting all sorts of different aquifers, which also plays into the sensitivity in this area. I don't have anything else to say about that slide because it's too sciencey for me. All right, this map shows kind of the area that we're talking about. This indicates the different, so this is the total DWSMA. It's called Drinking Water Supply Management Area. And so that's basically where all of the land, where all of the wells are drawing from underground. And you notice the different levels of sensitivity. And again, that's based on a series of factors that go into determining the sensitivity of those areas. The most vulnerable is in red, and that's very high. And the yellow is high. The light yellow is high, and the dark yellow or the dark orange is high, and the light yellow is moderate. And the Department of Health, which requires these wellhead protection plans, classifies anything as moderate or over as having additional regulations and thought looking at. You have to identify all the potential contaminant sources and anything that's moderate, high, or very high. And then the red area shows the 10-year capture zone for the quarry. So that's also an important thing in addition to drinking water, the surface water runoff from that area. And so this in total represents the capture zone for the quarry, and as well as the areas that we're really looking at with the with the drinking water protection overlay, those areas that have the most land uses. So with that, we've developed this proposed overlay district, and this is kind of a combination of us going through and looking at the different parcels that were involved in the DWISMA and kind of taking out parcels if we knew that they were parkland or that, and also cutting out those parts that were outside of the DWISMA but in the capture zone, for example. So staff WSB and Steve and we kind of worked together with planning as well to put together this proposed overlay district. So it's kind of a composite of a lot of different factors. And so that's where the ordinance would apply, is within that overlay district. And there's really two parts to this ordinance. One is to provide provisions for new development, building expansions, land disturbance activities within the overlay district. So to provide for new, regulations and thought and extra review looking at new development. And then the second is, okay, we've got all these existing businesses that are potential contaminant sources. So we want to look at what we can do with and how we can work with existing businesses to protect the aquifer as well. So the first part, really, when we're dealing with new development, these are the things we want to do specifically. Now, a lot of this is verification. So again, it's already required, but we're just making sure it's being done. We want an extra set of eyes looking at these site plans and paving required, for example. The council has granted waivers or exceptions or not enforced that in certain circumstances. But if it's in the overlay, we really want to make sure that our recommendation is strong for requiring paving in this particular district. Floor drains, grit traps, grading and drainage plans, stormwater basins, and things like this are already existing requirements. We added a requirement for wash pads and identifying the wash pad and making sure that it's got a proper drain in it. And so that's one new regulation on new development. And then looking at stormwater basins being lined, sometimes infiltration is something that we want to look at or consider. And in this area, we would not want to do that because the aquifer is really sensitive, and we don't want to necessarily encourage stormwater to infiltrate in this area. And then evidence of required permits for regulated substances. So regulated substance is something in a certain amount that is required to have a Minnesota Pollution Control Agency permit. And so we would ask for a copy of that permit as part of the development application or site plan review, which is something new. So the permit itself isn't new, but that verification, making sure that they've got their proper permits, is. Second part, it relates to existing businesses and new businesses too. It would be any business that is located or going to be located in this area. And again, most of these are things that are already required if they have regulated substances, but we would want to verify this through a city process. And I will just note that any amount of regulated substance would be subject to this ordinance, whereas the PCA has thresholds for amounts. And so we would take it down and say any regulated substance in any amount would have to follow these guidelines. So there's a little bit of a difference, but not too much between what the city will be requiring and the PCA already requires. Things like secondary containment, emergency spill response plans, and again, that evidence of the permits are already required. Those things are required by the PCA if you have over a certain amount. And we would just want to see verification of that. And so basically getting into the monitoring and enforcement of the ordinance, what Public Works is planning to do is to run an education campaign. So really let property owners know that they're in this overlay district, and we did that already when we had a property owner meeting prior to going through the city commissions. But annually provide them information on how they can be utilizing best practices and, making them aware that they're in this district. And most of the businesses in this district want to do the right thing, and they know a lot about how to manage their regulated substances as well. And so this is also letting the city know what they're doing and that they're aware of them. Because one thing I should note is some of the businesses have their own wells too. So while we're just looking at the city water supply, it's also in the best interest of the businesses, especially those who have their own private wells that use their water for commercial use, to protect that water supply as well. So it's also in the business's best interest to do this. And so this is sort of the new piece is that a biannual inspection every 2 years of properties, operations, and sites would be done. And we'll start with the potential contaminant source inventory that was done as part of the Wellhead plan, and we'll update that. And actually, the city just got a grant to do that from the MPCA. So at least the first year, they'll be able to do those inspections and update their potential contaminant source inventory with funds from the PCA. And then again, more targeted information for those specifically vulnerable to contamination, whether it's because they're in a high vulnerable area or because they have a lot of regulated substances. And you know, wells are a very large potential contaminant source because they're a direct line. So those with private wells would probably be especially targeted for just best practices. In terms of the schedule for adoption of the ordinance, we've been to the Parks and Natural Resources Committee, and we have the public information meeting on April 16th. And there were probably about 10 businesses here, so it was pretty good turnout. And I know Steve fielded some calls for people who couldn't come, but there were some good questions. And again, people just really want to do the right thing. And so that meeting went really well. The Planning Commission heard it on the 27th. We're here tonight. And then the anticipated adoption would be June 2nd at City Council. So with that, I'm happy to try to answer any questions as long as they're not too technical and engineering. But otherwise, Steve is available via email or phone to answer any of the questions if it's related to water use or some of the more technical aspects. Questions?
Commissioner John?
Yeah, my question is why did this come up now? Is there a reason for it? Was there something that, is it the MRQ, or what is it that brought this to our attention today rather than before?
Sure. Well, I think the general answer to that is that the Wellhead Protection Plan Part 2 identifies a bunch of implementation steps that the city writes it, you know, with a consultant and says, this is what we're going to do, PCA and Department of Health. Actually, it's the Department of Health, excuse me. And so, you know, then they're sort of responsible for implementing that. And the Department of Health does do, you know, check-ins with you. So I think it was really the leadership of Steve saying, you know what, this is a very sensitive area. We have all this information now that we didn't have before, you know, that has showed us how vulnerable this is. We have a lot of potential contaminant sources in this area. So let's do something more. And it's actually one of the few in the states that has actually implemented or will be implementing an overlay district, a zoning a tool and business provision tool for the protection of this. So it is really cutting edge. But I think Burnsville, given the aquifer vulnerability and all the businesses in there and the businesses that use the water too, is really well positioned to be that leader. And I don't know if you guys know any more under kind of how it came about, but that would be the general answer to that.
Commissioner Kleppe?
I had a follow-up to that question. Obviously, we do testing of the water. Is any heavy metals showing up since Kramer Quarry opened up, or any kind of chemicals that you're now worried about? So that is this something that's, you know, kind of a follow-up to that question? Is there something that has been discovered that we're now putting this in, or is it just sort of a proactive step to ensure that doesn't happen?
It's a proactive step to ensure that doesn't happen. So, you know, obviously to date, there hasn't been any major issues. And so one might say, well, you know, we haven't had any problems in the past. Is this a, you know, solution in search of a problem? But really what it is it's a raised awareness of the extreme vulnerability of it. And so while nothing has happened, you know, and it's more of sort of an emergency response type of thing. So if, you know, it's put into place to try to prevent an emergency spill or an accident rather than waiting for something to happen and then saying, oh, we should have done this. So it's very proactive, and again, it's kind of, as we've gotten more information, it's become aware that this is something we should do.
Another one.
Commissioner Klepper, you have a follow-up?
Well, I have a couple more questions. I'll be in line. Go ahead.
Okay, Commissioner Turner?
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions, so we can go back and forth. Budget. So I said 20,000 per year. Is the grant covering a part of the cost on top of the 20?
The grant would cover part of the 20.
Part of the 20. Does the grant run out?
Yeah, it is a one-time grant, but you can apply for them in the future. I know the Department of Health likes to move them around, and so
After you're cutting edge, they're gonna.
yeah, right,
give it to somebody
right.
else.
So the 20 grand, you got a grant for 10,000 from the Department of Health for this year.
Okay. And was that Skip? Do you know that was that budgeted for, or is that just part of in a general?
It would have been budgeted for.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna assume so.
I know for
just
2015
curious.
that Steve has budgeted for this ordinance, and then the whatever beginning of the implementation of it you can get done in 2015, and then the grant will cover part of next year.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Does that also cover that covers the semi-annual monitoring too?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I had a question on just the wells going down into the aquifers. I would be thinking that would be pretty safe from contamination, because some of those are 1,000 feet down. So how does the aquifers get polluted? Is it just from water with contaminants seeping through the 1,000 feet getting into the aquifer, or what?
The well is a direct.
Right.
So whereas other potential contaminant sources would happen through the seeping into the ground and then, making its way. And you do have some areas that have very high water tables where the aquifer is, not very low beneath the surface.
Okay.
And so those areas through seepage or water runoff or contaminants that get into the ground. But a well, because it's drill right down through the aquifer hundreds of feet, if there's contamination near the well, or somebody spills something in the well, then that's the direct link to the deep aquifer. Whereas 100 feet, a contaminant that gets spilled on the ground would take a long time to get 100 feet, and it would probably be very dissipated by then. So that's why they're identified as the most important to sort of protect that actual well.
So it's the private wells, not necessarily the city wells, that we're really concerned about.
Well, it's both. I think
Okay.
because the city takes precautions
Right.
and things and keeps their well houses locked, presumably. But then that would be less of a worry. And so, yes, the private wells are much more of a concern to the Department of Health, is identifying those. And, the inventory of those wells, which is done as part of Part 1 and Part 2 wellhead plans, that's a really important piece, just knowing where they are. There can be a lot of wells that have been improperly abandoned, so they're not used anymore, but they're just sitting out there. And so they have a well sealing program for those types of wells. The Department of Health does too. And I think that Steve has made a lot of progress to getting most of your wells sealed that are unsealed or have been.
Then a follow-up to that. Does Kramer is, that water is bubbling up, because they used to just pump that back into the river, and now we're capturing that. Does that pose a bigger threat? Because because it's surface, you could have surface runoff going into that area. Is that a bigger issue? Or not?
The goal is to keep the contaminants from getting on the ground to begin with.
Right.
And so it's an issue, and because you've got water runoff that potentially could run right into a surface versus seeping down over time, it could be a bigger issue. But that's the point of this program, is to keep those contaminants from getting on the ground in the first place, whether it's running off or seeping in, either way, that can damage your water supply. And so that's why that's the goal, is to keep it from getting on the ground either way.
And then another follow-up question. in a sense of being more green or ecological, businesses have been in the past encouraged to instead of paving over everything, make pervious surfaces to let the water soak into the ground. And this says we're going to pave everything. Now, when you pave everything, then it runs right off, right? So, and then it goes into the storm sewers, right? Which eventually gets, I guess, to the river.
Right, and for the aquifer protection, that would be better.
Yes.
So there are some cross purposes,
Right.
you know, and trade-offs that you have to think about. But
Right.
it would be better for the water to be captured and put in a lined stormwater pond, and then, you know, after it's settled, after the sediments have settled, then go into your stormwater system, and then eventually to the river. Then so have those pollutants do that and settle out. Then it would be to settle out into the ground. And so in areas where you have large outside storage, having those paved areas, especially in your highly vulnerable aquifer areas, is important for that reason, because you can pre-treat when it's part of the stormwater system.
I could have a lot of questions, but there's one more too. There are some ponds in Burnsville that have had to been dredged. Right? One Holden, wasn't that a recent one? Because of the amount of heavy metals. Wasn't it heavy metals? It was something. It wasn't just silt. It was something that run off from asphalt and stuff and gets into these ponds and creates problems, and it has to be dredged. Does that create a problem because that water just sitting there, and those ponds are probably not lined.
So that would be why it would be important to line your stormwater ponds in a very sensitive area, because then the sediment and pollutants settle,
Yep.
and then you theoretically clean them out
Right.
through your MS4, which is a whole different
Okay.
set of requirements and a different regulating agency. But through the PCA, they require you to do that, to have your water settle out, you know, and have those pollutants settle out in a stormwater pond before it's put into the bigger water bodies. And so cleaning those ponds is an important part of your public works function, your maintenance function, and that's exactly why, because they serve as pre-treatment.
Right, right.
And
does
so
the city do that regularly, clean out ponds? It does? Okay,
imagine they have a good program, MS4 program.
okay, thank you.
Commissioner Turner, did you have follow-up questions?
I do, but,
Go ahead.
yeah, well,
I'll wait.
yeah, I mean, I'm, not really a question about your review. My question is more about just the impact of the businesses in the area. So you mentioned that there were some hearings and informational meetings that already occurred. Can we evaluate, well, and the requirements seem to be certainly broader than what was already in place. So this is going to be a much more significant amount of rigor and review of the businesses in that area. Have we reviewed how many businesses that is, and if any of them are going to be immediately impacted? For example, those that might have regulated substances that meet the threshold set by the state, but now would be triggered by the more aggressive standard that we're proposing.
So we know how many businesses are in the overlay district. We did a mailing to all of them. I don't know the number off the top of my head, unfortunately, but we did 2,000.
We mailed to 2,000 addresses.
That'd be property owners.
Actually, we mailed to any business that was in the area. So, for example, if it was a building that had 10 businesses in it, we mailed to each one of those businesses. So, potential answer to your question, Commissioner Turner, is that the 10 that showed up were the 10 that after they read everything had further questions. I received one question myself, and as Ms. Rothstein said, I believe our Public Works Director, Steve Albrecht, received a few questions. In general, it did not seem to be something that was of grave concern to the business community.
Yeah, and I only asked not just from just how many businesses it would apply to, but also the time it would take the city to perform its biannual, or the biannual inspection, which if you're going through 2,000 businesses, it's going to take a while.
And
Obviously,
again-
it's not that, so.
Yeah, there we'd be talking property owners versus businesses, but we did notify every single business
Right.
In a property.
Well, and absolutely, I think we would prioritize those in the highest vulnerable areas and those that are already regulated by the MPCA, just to say, hey, we know you need to get permits to the PCA, and the web that's all available. What's in my backyard website is all available online of who gets those permits, so you can download a spreadsheet, cross-reference it, and say, all right, these are the businesses that have PCA regulated permit use. Substances and are in the highest vulnerable, and those are the ones I would think you would start with. And yeah, you definitely have to prioritize that list. And so as Steve develops sort of the implementation program for how that happens, those questions will be answered.
Commissioner John?
Yeah, I was curious on when they laid out the borders of the overlay district. I just noticed that on the west end, it doesn't go all the way over to Savage. I was surprised by that. Is there a reason for that? Why is there a little gap there? And
This map?
yes,
Is this one you're looking at? Well, this was based on the DWISMA, so this map. And so basically we focused on the highest vulnerability areas, so the orange and the red. And so this was developed as a part of the aquifer analysis. So we just looked at this, and then any areas that don't match were either identified as public land, or I think we took a residential development out because of the lack of potential contaminant sources. So we kind of took the line and edited it a little bit.
On this map you're showing here, is this the area that got the mailing? Or is it a broader area?
This was the area that we downloaded the parcel file for, so that the city could generate the mailing
Okay.
list.
Okay. Other questions, commissioners?
Great.
It would be staff's recommendation that the Economic Development Commission recommend the council adopt this overlay district. If the commission is in agreement with that, we would need a motion.
I'll move that.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the second. Motion by Commissioner Kleppe, second by Commissioner John. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
aye.
All those opposed, same sign. The motion passes. The next item on the agenda, item 5, is a review of the proposed amendment to TIF District 7, and our Community Development Director, Jenny Faulkner, is presenting.
Just bear with me while I get to, there we go. Commissioners, the item I bring before you tonight is for your consideration to amend TIF District Number 7. TIF District Number 7 was approved by the council in November of 2012. It went through this body, so some of this may be familiar to some of you. The items in blue on the map are the parcels that were included when we created TIF 7, and the purpose of this is to help facilitate the financing of the soils correction in the area, as well as any infrastructure needs. We just completed 13 and 5 since we adopted this TIF district, and our next area of improvements would be DuPont Ladybird Lane, which connects from County Road 5. Let's see here. Here we go. DuPont area improvements are next in this TIF plan, and then perhaps some interchange modifications at Cliff and 35 that we're currently studying. So the purpose of the TIF is to collect the revenue to be able to pay for those expenses. When we created this TIF district, we collected as much information as we could about the soils in the area. Short of going out and doing soil borings on every property, of course we didn't do that, but we did ask property owners who were interested in correcting their soil to come to the table and work with us to help them correct their soils in a way that was economically feasible for them and didn't take a lot of public investment. So that resulted in an ordinance change and some land use clearances, interim use permits that you see the dirt piles out there now that are being done. When we went through that process, the parcel that we're talking about to be added chose not to come and be part of that discussion. It wasn't until recently that we discovered that they have significant soil issues on that property. Had we known it back then, we certainly would have included it in this TIF district. There is no pending development at this time. We just see this as an opportunity to perhaps capture that increment of any future development and put it in this TIF district. Instead of adding it to TIF 7, we could have also created another TIF district, but that didn't seem ideal. So we're not proposing any amendment to the budget. Again, when we created that TIF district, we made certain assumptions about development in that area, and some of that has changed a little bit. For instance, we thought Park Jeep was going to build a brand-new dealership. Well, they ended up making some amendments to their current dealership, and they're going to go with that for now. So there were certain assumptions that information that we know today that we didn't know back then, so there's no need to change the budget. We did send notices to Dakota County, to ISD 191, and the council will be holding a public hearing at their meeting on next Tuesday. So with that, I will stand for any questions.
Commissioner Klippe?
So who owns this parcel? Do we know that?
I believe it's owned or held by United Properties.
Okay. And is there a possibility that there are other parcels in there that have bad soil that we don't know about at this point?
That's absolutely possible.
Okay. So it might be later that some of these other parcels that are not in blue would come forward and say, boy, my soil is problematic too, right?
It's possible. What we could do then is create a new TIF district, depending on the timing. There's certain laws that have to be amended, certain timing of things. So there has to be development within 5 years, for instance. So we have until 2018 to create any new TIF districts in this area. So.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Shaw?
What is the size of this parcel and any idea on the cost?
The size is about 10 acres. The proposed development scenario, if it were to be maxed out, could be up to 116,000 square feet of office warehouse is the scenario that we ran on numbers. And as far as the cost goes, I don't have any numbers on the cost for soil corrections at all. They have not approached us for any funding or assistance at this time.
Other questions, commissioners? Commissioner John?
So this one, is this right behind Menards there? I'm trying to get a,
So this is
okay. here's-
County Road 5, and then we've got the auto dealer here, and then this is an office warehouse building. There's two of them that are back to back, kind of, and then Gens Ryan is right here. So it's to the east of Menard. So it's right when you cross the bridge, just behind that existing office where if you were to stay on County Road 5 as far as you could go, you would basically run into this parcel.
Okay.
And I should add, just to let you know, of the soil work that started here, we have not entered into any TIF development contracts with these property owners. Those would have come before you, and they haven't. So any increment or anything that's collected there so far is set to go into the city's pool to help pay for the infrastructure investment. So that's our priority, is to capture that increment from all taxing jurisdictions so we can pay for the infrastructure in the area.
Other questions, commissioners? I believe staff would be looking for a recommendation for the EDA to adopt the amendment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ninos.
If you
That's my ask.
agree, we would need a motion.
I'll make a motion.
A motion by Commissioner John, second by Commissioner Shaw. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The motion passes. Item number 6 on our agenda is to review the liquor ordinance amendment, and I am going to move over to the podium so I can present. Commissioners, as you know, we have spent a considerable amount of time looking at our liquor ordinance. It started back in November. We met with our liquor store owners. We also held meetings with the Chamber's Public Policy Committee and the Chamber's Board of Directors. We presented back in January to this commission a number of proposed amendments. Our council met in what is referred to as our governance agenda in both January and February and reviewed all of those, took public testimony, took professional testimony, and council basically gave direction to staff to make some amendments to the ordinance. Basically, the ordinance covers both off-sale and on-sale. And in the off-sale portion of the ordinance, we are striking the limit based on population. So the existing ordinance would limit us to 12 off-sale licenses. There will no longer be a limit on the number of off-sale licenses. We will, however, retain the 3/4 mile restriction and the freestanding building restriction if you are outside of the Burnsville Center retail area. We are adding a definition of a brewer taproom license. It's basically a state definition. And we are also adding a definition for a cocktail room license, which applies to distilleries, into the ordinance. Both of those are basically state-defined definitions that we will be adding to our ordinance. On the on-sale portion of the draft amendment, as we were going through this, staff that basically handles all of our licensing said there are some miscellaneous housekeeping type changes that we should look at while we're going through this process as it relates to the on-sale. So we have also put those in our draft amendment. We have added titles, changed titles of certain folks in the amendment. Many of the changes are basically to incorporate a process and some legislative changes that have occurred in the past. We are adding some language that further defines code violations, relates them to zoning violations, and some further definitions of financial insurance issues. Basically, they are items that have been our process, but we are codifying them in there. Staff and our legal counsel are currently reviewing the recent legislation that has just passed within the last week or so. We will incorporate those legislative changes into our draft amendment before it gets to council on June 2nd. With that, I will certainly answer any questions that the commission has regarding the proposed changes. And staff's recommendation would be that the EDC recommend that council adopt the proposed draft amendment. And if you have questions, I will attempt to answer them.
I support this. It's, there's this whole craft beer issue is growing pretty rapidly, and some communities are taking really good advantage of that, opening brew pubs, and I think it's makes sense.
Commissioner John.
Do we have any brew pubs or places that are looking to sell growlers at this point that are ready to go?
We have a brew pub that is currently under construction. India Palace is doing the expansion to incorporate a brew pub. They have not actually made a decision yet whether they're interested in growlers. And my last conversation with the India Palace people where they want to get the extension built, the brew pub up and running, and then they will make decisions as it relates to growlers. Interestingly enough, in India Palace's situation, they are actually right outside of the Burnsville Center retail area. So if they want to do growlers, the 3/4 mile in the freestanding building will come into play, and they are at least 3/4 of a mile away from the next holder of an off-sale license. And the way the expansion is being built, the building will obviously be a freestanding building. So they will be okay if they want to sell a growler. They'll just need to come in and apply and go through the review process to get an off-sale license. Beyond that, we have no one in the works right now that is talking about a brew pub or a brewery.
You said they're outside of the area. Is Highway 5 the western border on the retail center?
Highway 5 is the western border on the retail center, except the shopping center that is north of 42 and west of 5 is in there. India Palace is south of 42. So there's a little loop that covered that little shopping center when the ordinance was put in play in 2009.
Oh, that's interesting.
Commissioner Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only question that I had was about the insurance. I think it's a state requirement, but just to confirm for me, before, if you didn't have sufficient financial responsibility, it was a suspension. Now, the language is being amended to be consistent with state law, which would essentially mean immediate revocation of the license. I just want to just confirm that's a state requirement. Automatic termination.
To Ms. Faulkner on that question.
It's under 3-1-9.
Commissioners, I know we changed this section to be consistent with the statute, all the stuff on the liability insurance.
Okay.
The piece about revoking it for that purpose, I am unsure if that's a statutory requirement or a local requirement. I do know that violating the statute triggers somebody to be in our violation matrix. I don't know what's driving it.
Right, and I wasn't sure if, there's a violation and then there's automatic termination of the license and you can't operate during that lapse. And it looks like there's a 30-day lapse, right? And then after 30 days, basically it's...
And where are you reading that, in the matrix?
No, I'm reading it under 3-1-9. It looks like there is no subsection number, so it just starts with, it would probably be the second full paragraph, last sentence. So it says, such lapse shall, and then it says, constitute automatic termination of the license. And no licensee may continue to operate during that lapse, but...
Got it. This is a statutory requirement.
Okay, so it's an immediate term with a 30-day lapse, and after 30-day, am I reading that correctly?
After 30 days, they have to apply for a new license.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, they just can't operate they have 30 days in which they can't operate, but in which to provide the appropriate information, or else they have to go get a new license.
Correct.
Okay. That's a state requirement. I just want to confirm, because it definitely is a deviation from existing.
Yep.
Commissioner Kleppe.
I have one more question on the growlers. Obviously, it would be tough to drink a whole growler on site at one time, but it has been done. But I was wondering, why is that in there? They have to take it off sale, obviously. They take it off premise. Is that the only reason that was included? If they sell growlers, now they have to be a freestanding building, and they got to be three-quarters of a mile away. And
Yes. Commissioner Kleppe, if you're going to sell a growler, typically the growler is something that the patron would buy to take home or somewhere to consume. That constitutes an off-sale. So that's an off-sale license. So yes, that's why it would then come under the off-sale portion of the ordinance, and the freestanding building in the three-quarter mile outside of the Burnsville retail area would apply. If I opened up a brew pub and I was not selling growlers, and I was just selling the beer I brewed and any other beer within my restaurant, I can go anywhere that a restaurant can go, and I'm fine. I just need an on-sale license.
Right.
Same thing with a brewery. If I have a brewery, I go into an industrial area, that's what the zoning would call for. I could have a tap room where I'm selling beer to folks that come to my brewery, and I'm still okay. I don't need an off-sale license. As soon as I decide I want to sell a growler, that's when the off-sale license kicks in, and that's when those other restrictions would kick in. So if I'm going to open up a brew pub or a brewery, and at some point I think I'm going to want to sell growlers, then I need to be cognizant of where I locate those businesses. And that will obviously be something staff, will discuss with any business owner that potentially might be heading down that path, is to make sure that they locate themselves in a portion of Burnsville in which they could legally sell growlers if they so desired.
Do you think that's pretty consistent with other cities, that they have that same requirement where if they sell growlers, they have to have an off-sale license and the three-quarter mile from another off-sale establishment?
To my knowledge, Commissioner Kleppe, the mileage restriction is unique to Burnsville, and there is one other city in the metro area, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I cannot remember which one that is. But that type of a restriction is extremely unique.
And does that serve, do you think that serves the city of Burnsville well, or do you think it impedes economic development? How would you?
Commissioner Kleppe, that is a policy question that our council addressed, and they elected to keep the 3/4 mile and the freestanding building in the ordinance.
Thank you for that edification.
Commissioner Copeland.
When you said that we were no longer using the 5,000 population, whatever, does that mean unlimited number of licenses off sale?
It means unlimited off-sale licenses as long as
With the 3/4
they
mile?
stay within the other restrictions.
Because we were talking at one time about having a different section for grocery store, liquor stores, but because of this unlimited licenses now, we don't need that. Is that kind of what they're thinking?
Yes, and again, that is a policy question, and when council went through governance, that was one of the ways in which they elected to address the policy questions, to say, let's remove the restriction, and that's going to allow a little more flexibility, but let's not get into all these subcategories. And the more subcategories you have, quite frankly, from a regulation and an enforcement and an inspection, it becomes a greater issue, and it becomes a much more confusing issue if you're a business looking to come into town. So we went, council went through that whole discussion during their governance and said, let's remove the cap and go from there.
Okay.
So if I can, what that means is there's no restriction in the Burnsville Center area.
Right.
So a grocery store in that area could have an ancillary liquor store. If Cub Foods wanted to add one on 42, they could. If Cub Foods in Heart of the City wanted to add one, they could not, because they're within 3/4 mile. But it will virtually be unlimited in that Burnsville Center trade area.
Okay.
Other questions, commissioners?
I have one.
Commissioner Shaw.
It's, so in the case of a restaurant that sells wine, for example, and they allow you to take the bottle of wine home, do they have an off-sale license once it's uncorked?
They do not need an off-sale license for that.
So then what would prevent someone from serving a growler and capping it off at half empty or half full?
Well, what would prevent them is the license they need and the possible revocation of whatever license they have. Could it happen? Of course it could.
But why is that different? Go ahead.
Commissioners, I believe state law allows that exception for wines on sale. They allow for whoever's the restaurateur or wherever you're at, the bar, restaurant, to cap it and allow you to take it off without an off sale, take it off site without an off sale.
Okay, thank you.
And brewers and growlers specifically have rules that you would need a separate off sale to be able to sell them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, commissioners?
Need a motion?
We do need a motion if the EDC is in agreement with staff's recommendation.
I'll make a motion.
Commissioner Shaw makes a motion, I assume, to adopt staff's recommendation. And do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Cherner seconds. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. The motion passes. The last item on our agenda is updates. We did in your packet supply you with the activity report for the last 2 months for STEM activities. I would only draw your attention to one item on there. On April 16th, staff did attend a meeting of the brokers at CBC Griffin Commercial. That is a brokerage in downtown Minneapolis. One of the principals in that brokerage is Jeff LeFavor, who addressed this group in March on our development policy panel. He did invite us to address all of his commercial brokers. That is something that we have routinely done with residential brokers, but this is actually the first time we've gone to a commercial brokerage. It was a very good meeting, and we're actually in the e-newsletter that we put out to the commercial broker community, we are alerting everyone that we're we would be willing to come and talk to them about what's going on in Burnsville, and we're actually attempting to bribe them because we do bring bagels if we show up for their breakfast meeting. The only other update is I would just remind the commission that next Wednesday, the 20th, is the BECRC, the Burnsville Commercial Real Estate Council bus tour. Right now, we have about 32 commercial brokers who will be on the tour. There will be a reception at 4 o'clock at the Ames Center for those brokers. If any of you are able to attend, if you just send me an email and let me know that, just so we have a count for that, that would be appreciated. Again, these are primarily the folks who bring our new businesses here all the time for us, so any thank you and everything else that we can give them is definitely appreciated. With that, we do need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Commissioner Kleppe makes the motion, second by Commissioner Shaw. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion to adjourn passes. Thank you, commissioners.